Hello everyone, my name is Deepak Dastrala. I'm CTO at IntellectAI. I'm really honored to have Professor Eugene Wu with me. And it's been last like probably few weeks or so. We were kind of exchanging our interests on some topics, and we found it quite interesting because our vision and Eugene's vision kind of quite we thought it's same. And I thought probably it'll be great opportunity for us to share our experience from an industry perspective, how I see what we have done so far and how we arrived at the vision, and again similarly from a Eugene perspective, how he saw that from academia, and then we all pretty much landed in the same topic, which is probably the what the future looks like from an AI for agent first organizations. So before I share how we landed up in this journey and what our journey looks like and what the future looks like, Eugene, would you like to introduce yourself and give your perspective on what you see with these agents and the AI first organizations looks like?
Yeah, definitely. So my name's Eugene Wu. I'm an associate professor of computer science at Columbia University. I'm also co-chair of the Center for Data, Media, and Society at Columbia's Data Science Institute. My research traditionally has been focused on core database systems and really systems for what we call human data interaction. And the idea there is essentially the way that humans use and work with data is through digital means, right? And so what are the software systems and what are the new capabilities and software designs that are needed to support them? How are humans and how are people going to be working with data and computational processes in the future, especially now with AI and agents? And so more recently, I've kind of I've started. I'm the director of a new research lab at Columbia, focused on exactly this problem. It's focused on data, agents, and the automation of processes. So we call it the DAP lab. And the goal here is to work on research problems that can't be solved now and really require like 3 and 5 years of sustained research effort in order to identify and kind of like solve the blockers that are really stopping organizational adoption of this kind of automation. It's potentially very, very powerful. Automation first and agent first organizations really means that almost everything within an organization, typically deployment of services, configuration, handling of kind of like requests, invoicing, and so on. A lot of this like back office work, a lot of it could be automated, right? To the extent that, what might be kind of 100-person organization could be 5 or 10 people. And so that's kind of the power and potential of this type of automation. And we've seen this kind of technology trends, in the past several decades, right? This move towards low code and no code for building applications. Today, it doesn't require like a team of 30 people or 50 people to build these kind of like mobile applications and web applications. It requires just one person with a creative idea, right? And then just using these no code and low code tools. And so that's kind of like the vision we imagine, but rather than for building an application, it would be for building an organization or building a particular process.
Eugene, that's quite interesting because even our journey, like it's a 10 years journey. And before my current role as a CTO, I was focusing on the strategy and innovation. And we have our design lab here. And the task that I have at my hand is like what the future looks like and how these, what that emerging technologies looks like, which will bring in the next set of efficiency for the organizations, kind of a thing. That's where for me I focused on the data and AI, and that's what we thought will be a very interesting. While in 2015 when we started, while the technology was in a very nascent stage, we spent time in terms of continuously figuring out by working on the various solutions. Then we built the products and then the platform, kind of a thing. So throughout journey we kind of understood what are the limitations and what are the challenges, especially in the organization context, because that's where it is always about like your lab name suggests, right? It's about what does that about data, what does it about a process, and what does that mean in the context of people and all. Because as we all know, the digital transformation journey, the biggest challenge is a change management and all. And while expectation is ideally for the digital transformation journey, everything is expected to be deterministic itself. That was so much of a challenge. Now with AI, with probabilistic, what does that mean? So there were actually I would say while this journey was going on in the last 2 years, especially after this GPT came in. There were two interesting movements which actually made me to understand where this is all going. One, we have in commercial insurance, there is something called loss runs, which is nothing but a claim history. It is one of the most complex documents where you can pretty much assume that there are four or five headers as a different rows under the same table, and the data could be across anywhere. So this is one of the interesting problem we spend time on, because always we saw the capabilities that we need to build is largely from a text and image perspective. So while we have a team of data scientists who is focusing on the problem for 3 years, we are pretty much like around 70%, 75% accuracy. And then one fine day, especially after the GPT-4 V came in, couple of engineers who just went on with the technology, and they came with a 90% accuracy in terms of an outcome for certain templates. When I looked into that, what really surprised me was suddenly the way the vision models are working, almost like a human kind of a thing in terms of a pattern recognition, which I never saw in my life before. While we were training and everything, that the pure already where this capability is there in a vision. Similarly, again, we were working in a lot of our use cases are around the back office use cases. That's where I thought there's a lot of alignment on where you think it can be applied and where we are applying. And in a financial services firm, when we applied the again that time we had a view that while everyone is talking about agents, we thought the reality is any critical decision in the business can never be taken by one person. It's always a group of people. There'll be a maker, there'll be checker, there'll be quality assurance and everything, because the cost of error is significantly high. So they never go that wrong. So when we are applying the AI here, we kind of simulated what does it looks like if those personas been given to these agents and how that looks like. And that's where we're really surprised with the kind of a reasoning capabilities. Because for example, let's say in a financial services firm, when you want to say that okay, this particular products cannot be sold for someone who is vulnerable and all. So we saw that it has interpreted the data and it has identified like a someone has a kind of Alzheimer's and all. It is just there in somewhere in the notes. It kind of immediately identified it's actually the client is vulnerable. So the kind of a reasoning and all kind of a surprised me on what's possible and all. And that's where we started focusing on what does it mean in terms of these agents coming and working together, and probably replicate what kind of the processes that happen in organizations, especially in back office, middle office, for critical decisions, and how to replicate that. And that gave a very that probably as a kind of a made us to pivot on this journey of a multi agents kind of a thing. What I would like to understand is, now from your perspective, and I know it's quite in the financial services from where the cost of error is very high and the room for such things is very low. How do you see what kind of a opportunity that you see from a research, and how do you see the kind of a frameworks or guardrails that is required to give the kind of comfort for the businesses, I would say, to bring the reliability and the resilience. So what's your view, Eugene?
Yeah, I think of kind of like two types of agentic kind of work. One is in terms of like augmentation, right? And in this, basically, the agent is kind of working in a read-only way to help basically synthesize and identify and search and analyze data, right? And even this is like very useful, because if you imagine like what an organization is, it's like a set of very complex rules, right? And like I just think of like the checklist manifesto in terms of like, in order for something to be reliable or to be checked off, you need to go through this big checklist of kind of like check this, check this, check this. Okay, like all of these, requirements and regulations need to be satisfied for something to be allowed, right? But the thing is, like, that's just like everywhere within an organization. So even just, offloading that mental labor to an agent to basically help you is very helpful. So one aspect that I see is simply offloading kind of like read-only knowledge acquisition work. But the other side is automation, right? And automation requires manipulating systems of record and modifying data. right? And when you do something like that, errors cannot be really tolerated, right? And the way kind of like you can imagine the basic way to do this is that a user sits there every single time you want to touch the database, right? And you want to modify something and it checks. And that person sitting there really is kind of just being held accountable for something someone else, some agent does. And so
Yeah.
there's a lack of agency on the person's behalf, right? In some sense. And so what safety means there is not that the agent is smarter, because it'll always make mistakes the same way even experts can make mistakes, but that the underlying data systems, the underlying infrastructure, the applications are all resilient to these mistakes, right? So that if a mistake is found, then there are ways of basically backtracking and fixing it. The way we do that today is basically very, very ad hoc, right? For something like Amazon and purchasing the wrong item, you can ship it back and there's these like fees involved. But in kind of like a financial setting, a mistake could incur like fines, or it can incur other types of penalties that effectively force, in a very expensive sense, to undo that operation, undo that error, right? And so agents can be helpful for catching errors, for automating kind of like thinking and kind of like knowledge acquisition, but also in terms of modifying and making decisions. But the underlying system, the entire environment, needs to be set up so that undoing and safeguards are fundamentally built in.
Okay. I think it's quite interesting, Eugene, because while if you see this AI perspective, agents perspective, models perspective, there is a tremendous progress that is happening. At the same time, the underlying systems and the infrastructure or databases or hardware is pretty much same as what it was built for the previous, probably previous world, non-agentic world, kind of a thing. I think while lot has changed from an AI perspective, but still underlying infrastructure like a databases and all, it still remains same, and they are not really ready for the agentic world. So at least how do you see the opportunity, or how do you see the journey?
Yeah, I mean, with technology, it's just like you said, change management is a big piece, right? And initially, right now, I think the adoption for the next several years is going to be on read-only knowledge augmentation, right? Basically, fetching and finding the right piece of data, synthesizing the right piece of data, so that an existing human can make a decision using existing systems. But we also imagine like 5, 6, 7 years down the line, there'll be new types of companies that are agent first, right? Agentic first. The same way, kind of like 40, 50 years ago, right? The first companies that were database first on top of relational databases came to basically like, rule enterprise in some sense, right? Those are like SAP and Oracle were those first companies. And so like that evolution is certainly going to happen within the next decade. And so I think like the change management has to happen within the organization, but then within the ecosystem as well.
Yeah. And usually when you look into the operating models, even with an existing structure, I think at least with where we are working, what we are seeing is the first set of use cases where we are able to operationalize is in the areas of a risk, compliance, and the governance. Because if you see right now in a banking industry, for example, almost at an average, top banks together they pay $250 billion fine every year, every single year. And that's because if you see, right, they most of them approach through the very sampling based approach, and they don't have a ability to cover the whole, I would say, that their estate, kind of a thing, because there is a shortage of experts, and the way the data is growing is impossible for them and all. So this is the at least the one area where we see a huge opportunity to really get it right. And again, this is a classic use case of read-only data, kind of a thing, rather than thing. And I think probably this gives an opportunity in terms of people to figure it out. What does that mean to the rest of the businesses? Is what we see. I think from your perspective, uh, how do you see at least the from the operating model and the business model? how this will evolve, and where what the near term will look like and what the long term look like?
I think what you're describing, and it's like, really spot on, is essentially like navigating bureaucracy, right? The way a lot of these like regulations and policies and risk management work is that over the years they're peppered on top of each other, right? To safeguard like exceptions that they found. And so,
Yeah,
holistically across decades, what happens is like normal business of operations works, and that's totally fine. And then there's these like big exceptions. And then like everyone is penalized essentially in
yeah,
order to prevent these exceptions, right? And that's what
right.
bureaucracy fundamentally is. If you look within a large organization, there's all these well-meaning policies, right, that have been set up. But
Yeah,
globally, that's a huge tax on everyone. That's the same case with government as well. And so I think like just an immediate huge opportunity is simply navigating bureaucracy, whether or not it's like accessing government services after a disaster, whether or not it's being able to service more and more potential customers that you don't have the resources to allocate a human to. For instance, like small businesses is an
yeah,
area where it's typically underserved, right? Because allocating a salesperson or an engineer to an individual small business is just like too expensive. But this is
yeah,
possible now, and so exact same when you're talking about it in finance.
yeah. I think that's a beautiful point, because in typically in the lending scenario, right? Um, the joke within our team is, we say, to prove that you need a loan, actually, and to get a loan, you need to prove that you don't need a loan. And so but the truth is that exactly the challenge for the SME customers, and the average person out there. But if you see, when the biggest defaults always happens in these large companies, kind of a thing. And historically, the people have seen the role of an automation is largely from an FTE perspective, the full-time employees that you required, how you can optimize and everything. But with AI, the value that I see is what is the cost of making the right decision. Is
Yes.
ideally,
Yes.
and that is what people ignore. And I think this is what I think is probably one of the things which we typically talk to our customers is, a typical automation where you look only from an operational efficiency, okay, how I can do more with less, kind of a thing. But in this case, you also need to consider what is the cost of getting the decision right and all, so that your non-performing assets will be very less, your balance sheet will look really good, and you might end up lending to the person who actually will pay that back on a time, and so that your business will become more profitable. So this is the one of the thing probably, I think a lot of people are still yet to understand the value. So how do you see, from, because as you rightly said, right, if you can serve those undeserved people, and if you can expand our services uh, with the same level of equality irrespective of the value, what does that mean? So what's your view, especially on the decisioning perspective and those things?
A big piece from the research standpoint, right? As an academic lab, we're not building products. We're looking
Yeah,
at is like what's the big research that needs to happen, and
yeah,
one really big piece is essentially monitoring, like you're saying. If you have this agentic framework and all these agents, going around doing work, you can't also rely on them to self-assess, right? To some extent, like that's you can hope that they'll do it, but you
yeah,
need basically a monitoring system to be
yeah,
checking. And what you need to check is essentially risk
yeah,
from like a real world perspective, right? Not just like, did they get this number right? Does it look
yeah,
wrong? But like, what is the implication of that? And that's not something that correlation necessarily can find you, right? That requires some causal reasoning to be able to say this type of decision, right, actually affects kind of like finances or affects a customer in a particular way. And the negative consequences are so large that we need to actually bump it up and to really double check, right? And
yeah.
so like that system, that monitoring system needs to be there pervasively in order
Yeah.
to safeguard.
Absolutely. And another interesting opportunity that we see, and the pattern is emerging, is, if you see historically, all these decisions are very rule based. And the truth is,
Yes.
how much of the rules that you can configure, it is not realistic when the world is changing so fast out there. the biggest value of this agentic approach, what I see, is how you can make it a goal based, so that you have a goal, and then you are actually trying to bring in the contextuality from the market and other dimensions that actually do that, so that you are still sticking to the goal, but you're taking a lot more into the consideration. And so how do you see, again, from the frameworks perspective and your research perspective, how do you see this evolving?
Yeah, I exactly agree with kind of, like this moving away from rules oriented, right? Basically, what rules oriented means is like people need to adapt to the rules. And
Yeah.
what we've seen here just with chatbots, right, and these like co-pilots, is that
Yeah.
these machines are basically, for very limited context, but very excitingly, are adapting to the user needs, right, in the user context, whether or not it's programming or whether or not it's kind of like, asking questions through, Siri and so on, right? They're
Yeah.
they're coming to the user.
Yeah.
And I think that changes the nature of what even human computer interaction, right, human, like interfaces even
Yeah.
means, because typical interfaces are designed for what is happening right now, right, the common case. But the thing with
Absolutely.
automation is like the common case you've already solved, right? You've already decided it's fine. It's all of the exceptions. It's kind of like extracting the preferences and all of the organizational, like institutional knowledge locked
Yeah.
inside someone's brain, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of like where interfaces and user interaction really will go.
Yeah. I think that's so interesting, because that's what I was thinking, right? I think in the last decade or so, people have built the portals with hundreds of screen and so much of information. But at any point of a time, the end user looks only what he or she needs at that moment. They really don't care about how many tabs and everything and all. And as you rightly said, that frame really helped the people capture only certain things, and but a lot is there in their head which they never have a way to express or interact. So because you said the point of human computer interaction, right? So how do you see this changing and all, and how, what happens if someone starts an organization now, and if they're building the company now, I don't see they approaching in the same way. They'll build 100 screens to capture some information. So what do you see, how it will evolve, and what opportunity people have?
I think the fundamental kind of like capability that like agent first organizations will focus on is allowing agents to navigate action spaces, right? Basically, all the things that require like humans to move and to click on things and to think, those are things that you can automate, right? An agent can basically try a million times to solve the same task, right? If the underlying systems allows for that. And what that means now is it's the user's job to basically say, which of these options do I prefer or do I think is suitable for my kind of like for my task? And so that
Correct.
changes the nature of what people do. And just like you said, it's about defining the task and then assessing kind of the many, many possible responses that are valid, right? And some might be invalid, in which case it's the person's job to say, this set of options are actually out of bounds, like never really consider that anymore. And then
Right.
within the valid set of options, to pick which one makes the most sense. And that's a value judgment. And that's something that, of course, like humans will fundamentally need to be able to provide.
See, from our organization, right, already with the platform that we build, we are already seeing how the roles are changing. For example, I mean, the agent designer is one of the expertise. How someone can build the agent which is actually close to the human person arm, and also more importantly for the role that person does. What does that expertise means? Okay, what does that competency means? How we can design the agent and all, but also equally about the people, how they can architect that particular knowledge, how they can organize the knowledge, because the data and the information right now is across the various I mean, from a systems to the data warehouses to the data lakes to so many things. But the one we believe strongly is who can really organize their knowledge really well, and also who can do it in such a way that will continue to stay relevant with more and more data and information coming in and all. So the knowledge architects. And again, some one what is a one probably think a lot of people missing is, while agentic AI is coming, but the fundamentals of the software engineering still remain same. How you can build things in a very modular, reusable way, and what the scalability means, and other things and all. So who are the agent architects who can really get that right and all. So at least this is how we see the roles changing. But also what is going away means that the role for the builders in a typical way, I think this gone, because as you rightly said, if someone has a clarity of a thought, actually agent can do the most of things. So but one who can architect, one who can design, one who can configure better to get the right outcomes is a thing. And I know what also we are seeing is the people who resist the change and who probably find it difficult enough, because the pace of change is so much, kind of a thing. So the traits that we also saw was, uh, where it's not working is who has a challenge with adaptability, who has a challenge in terms of actually accepting the reality with the that, okay, yesterday you learned something, today got changed, now let's just adopt and all. So I think this is what we see: one who's curious, one who can actually imagine it too, and also one who's actually has the enough focus on the fundamentals. We saw them really actually doing really well. So I think from your perspective, I know academia, like you have some brilliant students out there in Colombia, but what we are also what was interested is how this is evolving from an interdiscipline perspective, because we see the future roles as a more of a fusion, not just one thing. So how do you see from your perspective, and what you think it will work for the future?
Yeah, I think there's many perspectives, right? From like a student standpoint, like, what should students be learning? Right now, I would say over the past couple of years, students have become very good at prompting. Like, like whether or not it's in classes or in other contexts, like it's just like prompting is everywhere and they're so good at it, right? But
Yeah.
the thing is, like, I think there's a risk to that, which is, if it's so easy to just prompt and say these high level things, it's hard to get into the nitty gritty, right? And whether or not it's like a PhD student or a master's student and undergrad, like it's easy to say an idea, but it's hard to build a company, right? Because
Yeah.
once you start actually trying to do something, all the details matter, and you need to know which details matter and which don't. And so
Yep.
that's why, what I've heard more and more is that expert software engineers are very effectively using kind of like AI code generation, because
Yep.
they basically just want to do the scaffolding and then they can identify the errors and then edit the code as they wish. But novices are having a hard time. Like, they can basically make flashy demos, but that's really it, because they don't know what to focus on. So I
Yep.
think like a big kind of like thing for education is for students and for educators to make sure that that part is clear, right? So it's clarity of your thought, but also the knowledge is important to know what's correct and what's not.
I think that's a beautiful point, Eugene, because what I also observed is some of the folks who directly started with the data science spent a lot of time in models. Now LLMs have abstracted a lot of it. So AI is as much as an engineering problem rather than the data science problem right now.
Yes.
And the one who directly jumped into the data science and didn't give enough attention to the fundamentals of software engineering, they're kind of struggling and all, because as you rightly said, they can do the flashy demos, but when we put out there to operationalize certain piece of work, especially in a place like a bank, the scalability, the security, what is expected is really the best in class. And that one can understand only when they have a real in-depth understanding on the nitty-gritties, like what you said. I think that's great. Again, I think
Yeah,
from
it's like data science, like, somehow shifted towards data engineering, right? Because if you
absolutely.
don't know how the data was collected and what you
Yeah,
can do with it, how can you possibly make an accurate prediction? And what I see like with agents is you have to understand business processes now, not just like a data source anymore. Like, you need to really more understand like how the
yeah.
business and how operations works.
I think very true. I think even as you rightly said, even with the prompt engineering, the people who could build the agents, basically non-engineering folks, if you look in right, what's common with all of them is they really understand the domain very well and they really understand the data very well. And those are the one who actually is able to produce a better outcomes and all. Because I think probably for good or bad, it's for briefly, I think industry, especially data science, a lot of focus went on to the models, and they really didn't spend enough time on the data and the domain. And I think most of those folks are at this moment struggling with LLMs, kind of abstracting most of it and all. But the one who gave enough focus on the software engineering, even enough focus on understanding data and data engineering, are actually doing really well, and they're able to make a huge difference. I think, see, one of the always when the AI comes, the question is about the ethics, responsibilities, and other things, right? And all. I know well there is a lot of work that is happening. See, from our perspective, um, we spend a lot of time in terms of ensuring how we bring the trust to the end user, what that explainability means, what that fairness means, and everything and all. But again, because the use cases are also evolving so much, and the technology is also evolving so fast, it is kind of a question always there in the minds of people and all. So what's your view, where you think at this moment we are in terms of answering those questions?
Yeah, I think there's a big ethical risk, right? There's two immediately that come to mind. One is in terms of like using AI of any sort as gatekeeping, right? Basically allowing people through either for kind of like loans or for subsidies or for help or resources of any sort, right? Like that kind of gatekeeping, if it's susceptible to bias or if it's non-transparent or people don't trust it, is a very, very risky and undesirable kind of like aspect, right? And for there, it's not a pure technology problem. It's how you deploy the technology too, right? And how you choose to use the automation. If you use the automation to say, well, most people that I know should pass through, so that I can devote the existing resources to focusing on cases that are difficult or that need special attention, that seems to make sense. But if kind of like the use case is to just I think like, recently I read an article about United Healthcare, right? Where apparently like they had this like AI that was just rejecting like 70% of claims for elderly people, right? And so
Yeah.
if you use it in that kind of like blind way, then of course there's huge implications, right? So I
Right.
think like, how you thoughtfully use it is one aspect for gatekeeping.
Yeah.
I think, but there's opportunity as well, because like it can be used for accessibility as well, right? So like
Correct.
making your services, making kind of like opportunities easier. I think
Yeah.
that's something that is very, very exciting, because a lot of what we talked about today is bureaucracy, and that's
Yeah.
a tax on the less privileged, right? And the less resourced. And so that's something that can be very, very powerful.
And I think that's a great thing, especially the accessibility part, right? Right now, I think this, if we use it really in a right way, it can reduce the gap or the divide. Right now, it is there with many of those products and services out there, and also probably the kind of a, how I also see is in organizations where they're really struggling for the kind of an expertise, and always there'll be few stars, everyone will be waiting for their time. How we can make that expertise available across the organization in a very standardized way. I think that helps actually probably distill the knowledge and probably reduce the divide. Is another opportunity that you see. But more importantly, what's important is like having the right understanding of what the gatekeeping looks like and where it can be deployed and where it's not. I think I completely agree. uh, Eugene, I think from here where it is right now, what we personally see at least the financial organizations that we are working is, I think it's a kind of a very unique movement where I think people see an opportunity, they can have a disproportionate benefits by leveraging it. At least in a near term, our focus is on how we can leverage the incumbents in terms of becoming an agent first organization, and also probably the startups to have a very probably provide those kinds of services, which at this moment there is a gap in the probably the economy out there, kind of a thing. So for us, how we can help the incumbents to become agent first, and how we can probably help the startups to be competitive out there, is what we are looking for, kind of a thing. But again, there are many questions which need to be continuously answered, and the many technologies that need to be built to actually give the confidence, both in a short term and a long term and all. Where that's where we want to work with the people like you and just have the uh, solutions from both from short term and the long term. But what we are also clear is probably the industry in a very interesting moment. Uh, there are a lot of chances for incumbents to either become a uh, Disney, rather than Blockbuster, or probably the startups to become a Netflix, than the Blockbuster. I think it's everything is everything will be reset, and all, and I think so. Incumbents can continue to be relevant and rule like what the Disney is doing, or the startups can suddenly come and become a Netflix, and we want to be in a position where we'll be able to help either of them. Kind of that's how we are looking, at least from our vision perspective. So how do you see? I mean, from your perspective, what that near term and the short term looks like?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. As part of like building this lab, we've been kind of like looking for partners, right? And Intellect is one of the initial partners. But we've been looking across the industrial landscape because, like this kind of technology is a tool, and that tool can be wielded by really anyone and it affects kind of like everyone. So for instance, like for a cloud business, they want to be the infrastructure, right? But like, what is the right agentic framework? What is the right set of kind of like infrastructure components to be providing? So that's a big question, but that has to do with, well, services companies and industry and consumers, right? And what their requirements are and what even kind of automation means in their minds, right? And like which of those can be translated into technology and which of them are fundamentally kind of human and organizational problems. And so what we've been looking at is just the wide spectrum. I think in the short term, a lot of things are going to be knowledge acquisition. And to be very frank, like, when I talk to a lot of potential partners, all of them basically say like we can't hire enough people for many of the things that we want to do. So it's not a problem of like replacement as much as like empowerment and kind of like, like meeting demand where it is.
Yeah.
But in the long term, I do think kind of startups are fundamentally able to move faster. And if it is a technology play where speed and kind of like evolution matters a lot, then there'll be a big paradigm shift, right? If it's fundamentally capital intensive and knowledge intensive, then legacy players still have room because like they're sitting on a wealth of knowledge and institutional like capital. So I think I can't possibly predict what'll happen, but the change is certainly going to happen. Yeah.